Thanks for coming. We're going to get started. There are still some seats in the front, plenty of seats in the front if you'd like to come on up. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Warehouse Auditorium, especially our friends from geography who've made the pilgrimage down here from the Hill. It's my pleasure to welcome Ed Soja back to his alma mater, Syracuse University, where he earned a PhD in 1963 in geography and taught briefly in 1965. Ed is an international figure. He's just returning from Paris. Next week he's off to Santiago, Chile. The next week Copenhagen, so we're extremely fortunate he could be with us here today. Today's lecture charts an increasingly important transdisciplinary exchange between architecture and geography. It continues a trajectory of presentations from last semester by Laura Kurgan, Eric Cadora, and Saskia Sasson. This lecture is sponsored jointly by the School of Architecture and the Geography Department, and I'd like to thank Todd Rutherford, Jennifer Hindman, and Don Mitchell in Geography for making Ed's visit possible. Ed Soja is Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics, where he teaches during the fall semester, and Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning at UCLA, where he teaches courses in urban political economy and planning theory. After starting his academic career as a specialist on Africa, for the last 20 years, Ed has focused his research and writing on the critical study of cities and regions, specifically the urban restructuring of Los Angeles. His work on LA brings together traditional political economy approaches and recent trends in critical cultural studies. He's particularly interested in the ways issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality intersect with what he calls the spatiality of social life, and with the new cultural politics of difference and identity this generates. In addition to his work on Los Angeles, Ed continues to write on how social scientists and philosophers think about space and geography, especially in relation to how they think about time and history. His latest book brings this research together in a comprehensive look at the geohistory of cities, from their earliest origins at Çatalhöyük to the more recent development of what he calls the post-metropolis. This is also the title of his most recent book, Post-Metropolis: Critical Studies of Cities and Regions. Other important books include Third Space, Journeys to Los Angeles and Other Real and Imagined Places, Postmodern Geographies, The Reassertion of Space in Critical Social Theory, and a volume edited with Alan Scott titled The City, Los Angeles and Urban Theory at the End of the 20th Century. Now, although Ed himself might disagree with this characterization, he's frequently included as a key member of what some have termed the Los Angeles School of Urbanism. It's a group of loosely affiliated but eminently provocative urban thinkers, which also includes the likes of Mike Davis, Michael Deere, David Harvey, Alan Scott, and Michael Storper, among others. Something else Ed might disagree with is that although he teaches in an urban planning department, and his progressive space-first thinking is also indispensable for planners, I personally think he actually favors the fields of geography and architecture over urban planning. Planning just happens to provide a logical forum within which some of the most pressing concerns of these two other fields can be debated. Today's lecture is another such forum, and we're delighted to have Ed with us today. Please join me in welcoming Ed Soja.
All the technology is working. It's a delight to be here. I'm going to make just one argument this evening under this title. Actually, the official title was putting Cityspace first, but you'll see that it's basically the same argument. But this argument I'm going to make is, I can't exaggerate how jumbo it is. It's a very big argument, a kind of culmination of developments in spatial thinking over the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the argument most simply is that there is a power that we are only recently discovering a generative power that comes from the cities that we produce, from the city spaces that we build and structure. Cities are very simply defined in general as agglomerations of people, activities, and the built environments associated with them. For years, we have traditionally seen cities as backgrounds to all kinds of activities. In recent years, we've begun to see cities as having some, I don't want to use the word magical, but sometimes it's difficult to describe the extraordinary power that has, in just the last 5 or 10 years, been ascribed to Cityspace, that specific geography of cities that we create, that we shape, and then shapes us. Much of social theory, Western thinking, gives very little attention to the generative power of cities. But now we have people who are talking about cities as the primary generative force of economic development of all kinds, technological change, aesthetic creativity, the production of culture, of economic development, of all of the major forms of societal change and development in history. So it's an extraordinary argument that I'm going to try to explain and make in a variety of ways. I've been trying to make a similar kind of argument from the very modest phrase that geographers are very familiar with, that for many years geographers have been urging on others. And it's something that's shared with architecture as well. And that's the notion that geography matters. This is now so far beyond simply stating that geography matters. It's the beginning of an exploration that is likely, in my view, to become the center of attention for the rest of the 21st century as we begin to uncover this extraordinary, and explain and understand, because we know very little about it, this extraordinary generative power of cities. I'm going to make this argument, as I say, in many different ways, but I'm not going to extend the argument very far into either empirical research or design. But I cannot think of anything that is more important to guide future empirical research in all of the disciplines in these transdisciplinary situations, and into any aspect, all aspects of design, than this extraordinary argument that is summarized by the notion of putting cities first. The starting point is as interesting as anything else. That much of what's been happening in the last 5 or 10 years looks back to one person and one book in particular as having made a discovery that Nobel Prize winning economists today have suggested should have earned Jane Jacobs the Nobel Prize in economics, and probably in other disciplines as well. But Jane Jacobs wrote a book in 1969 with the title The Economy of Cities. And almost everyone that is working on the generative power of cities today goes back to Jane Jacobs, including, by the way, I might as well mention, given the geographical context that we're in, that of course I had to pass through the hellhole of Chicago to get to Syracuse, and the usual ritual 3-hour delay allowed me to look in the bookshop and find on the top shelves a book that I'm afraid that you'll be seeing a lot of and hearing a lot about. I don't encourage you to buy it because he's going to make enough money out of this that he doesn't need your work. If you can steal it, that's fine. And it has the horrible title, which will probably work, called Who's Your City? Or something like that. Who's Your City? And it's a book by Richard Florida, who is known for his work on the creative class and the creative cities. And he also starts out, well, I'm sorry, the book actually starts out with a discussion of his famous appearance on the Colbert Report, and how he interacted on these issues with Stephen Colbert on television. But the substance starts out with Dear Jane Jacobs. And the argument is encapsulated in a way that is very interesting and often overlooked, with this simple statement: without cities, we would all be poor. Everybody nods the head, yeah. But what she is saying, she is saying in this statement, and she goes on to explain it, is the mother of economic development, not because people are smarter in cities, but because of the conditions of density and a concentration of need, greater incentive to address problems in ways that haven't been addressed before, etc. And what she was saying is that, and she does this in this book, The Economy of Cities, is that for 12,000 years, ever since hunters and gatherers began to settle down in urban settlements that I think legitimately should be called cities, all forms of societal development and economic change have been generated by the city itself, by city space, by socially constructed city space, not naturally or God-given space, not a physical external environment, but the socially constructed space. Architects should have no problem in understanding that the cities we live in are socially constructed, not all by individual architects, but socially constructed nonetheless, that this space that we construct shapes our lives in ways that we are only beginning to understand. So this is a major starting point, Jane Jacobs, in 1969, when she made her arguments in The Economy of Cities in 1969. Almost no one was able to understand where she was coming from and how she could possibly make this statement. She was considered crazy, a nut on this time. And I'll come back to this in terms of some of the other arguments she's made. And something also was similar to the second starting point I have here, a person I've drawn on very heavily in my work, Henri Lefebvre. And in a way that the two are related. Here's another one of these statements that at the time either was incomprehensible or just easily tossed aside as, again, impossible to conceive of. But what he states here is the development of society, that's a pretty broad statement, the development of society is conceivable only in urban life through the realization of urban society. And now what he's saying is that there has never been a society that is not urban. And what is being added, that all societies from the very beginning have been developed and changed over time through the generative force of cities. I won't get into tremendous detail here. If you're interested, it also takes you back to Jane Jacobs' book, where she talks about the construction of the rural, the creation of the agricultural revolution as arising from this generative power of cities. I gave it a name, I called it Cynicism. That hasn't caught on particularly, it doesn't matter. Wikipedia has it, and then they were going to challenge it because they said it's too associated with one person. And then some other people wrote in, and I think it may still be there, I don't know. So if you want to support cynicism in Wikipedia, Wikipedia also sort of defined me as Edward Said, and said I was born in occupied Palestine in 1935. But so I'm not a great truster of Wikipedia. But so the argument here is very similar to the argument that Jane Jacobs is making, that there are no non-urban societies. All society has been urban. And not only that, all societal development has been linked, by the way, not as the only cause. I want to make that clear. I use the word primary, which is about as strong as I can. among many causes of societal development, we're beginning to understand city space as having this force. And here he goes on. I often use visuals now, of course, talking with architects, but I put text in my visuals so that I can mix up my own work with the visuality. I do have some visuals later on. Okay, let's go on because I'm going to be relatively slow at the beginning and then probably a little faster later on. Putting cities first is more than just a statistical fact, because now probably every one of you have heard, most people who talk about cities start with the United Nations announcement that in 2006 officially the majority of the world's population could be said to live in cities for the first time ever in human history. That city dwellers outnumber rural dwellers, at least according to official UN statistics. So we've reached an even more urban age than ever before. But what I'm saying goes well beyond the statistics of large cities, but to the whole force that arises from urban agglomerations of various sizes. By the way, we don't even know yet whether big agglomerations are more generative than small agglomerations, so there's some hope for Syracuse. Sorry. But we know that the agglomeration or clustering process is much, much more important than we had ever imagined. Here I go foregrounding the stimulus of urban agglomeration, suggesting a radical shift in Western social thought towards a kind of understanding of causality coming from space. We've been accustomed for a long time, particularly in geography, to understand how social and political and economic and cultural processes shape space. But we have been less comfortable in following the other direction, how the geographies that we produce shape culture and class and economy and politics. Today we're beginning to realize that process works both ways in very powerful ways as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is becoming more comprehensible today than it was in the 60s and early 70s. I'll come back to this in a moment too. In the 60s and early 70s, some ideas similar to this were beginning to come out, but the intellectual world at the time was so biased against geographical thinking or against any attempt to talk about geographical or spatial causality. Geographers kept it secret and architects kept it secret. You were design determinists and we were environmental determinists in geography. And we could only talk to one another because if we ever talk to social scientists or others, they think we're awfully nuts, right, about this forms of non-social determinism. But today, spatial thinking has taken on that word that John used and others use here, that our computers don't really like and underline is not acceptable, transdisciplinary. Across all disciplines, we're beginning to see an extraordinary adoption of critical spatial thinking, well beyond the so-called spatial disciplines of architecture, geography, and urban and regional planning. I think I agree with you about favoring architecture and geography over planning, but mainly urban planning, but what often gets left out is regional planning. And if anything, I'm more a regionalist than an urbanist, and that's why I constantly talk about critical cities and regions, and really should put this as putting city space and regional space first, or city regions first. But I will mention something about that in a moment. Okay, you could read the rest. What I'm going to rush through somewhat tonight, maybe this comes with age or something, one sits down and realizes that there's some possibility of relatively early mortality, and so one starts thinking about what one must do before one can no longer write things. inspired, by the way, by Henri Lefebvre, who published, I think, 40 books after he retired at 65. So I'm quite modest in hoping that I can, in the future, produce at least some of these 10 books. I also offer them to you, in case I can't make them all, to invite you in participating in the projects, because they're all interconnected and they all make important supportive arguments for the case I've stated today. Again, foregrounding urban spatial causality and explanation, and some of the theoretical revisions in all disciplines, including architecture, that this kind of thinking can make. So the rest of my talk is just to briefly outline what I think these 10 books are, but particularly to try to sort of explain a little bit of the essence of each, and to try to see if I can make a couple of connections, if I can, to some debates in architecture. There we go. Well, I start with something that sounds wildly, well, it is abstract, but also of extraordinary concrete importance, and that's what I call the great ontological distortion. Something happened in the last half of the 19th century that resulted in a privileging of time and historical analysis and understanding, and a, if you want, subordination or deprivileging of geography and spatial thinking, a relative distortion of what up to that point I think can be argued in all of Western thought and probably Eastern thought as well, was a relative balance between the spatial and the temporal, the geographical and the historical, going way back to the Greeks if you want, with neither of the two privileged over the other. How to explain why this happened in the 19th century is an open question, but that it happened, I think, is of extraordinary, utmost importance and needs to be focused on. What it gave rise to is something that I have called social historicism, a focusing in on two of the three fundamental aspects of all human existence and human life. We are all fundamentally, from the moment of our birth, spatial, social, and historical beings. We have three sides. Our biographies are always social, historical, and spatial. Societies evolve over time, space, and social organization. All right, by definition. There is always a three-sidedness to life, the most basic ontological dimensions of the living being, of the living human being. Physical scientists know this with no problem. All of the world physically is composed of space, time, and energy and matter. Three sides, right? And this is taken as an assumption. In Western social thought, however, we've been biased towards the social and the historical, and their interaction, their dialectic, if you will, whereas geography has been pushed to the background. And so I think we need many books that explore this ontological distortion of the late 19th century, symbolized in the italicized bullet here, the title of a famous book by someone who's very somewhat hot in architecture these days, was hotter a few years ago, and that's the ontologist, the philosopher Heidegger, who wrote about dwellings, so the architects get excited by it. But Heidegger was the codifier of this bias, this ontological bias, one of the most powerful codifiers, in his work on Zeit und Sein, time and space, rather than having a time and being, time and being without space, ohne Raum. Just as an exercise to show how ingrained this time bias is, just with that word. We have wonderful fun with the word Zeitgeist. How about the word Raumgeist? Think about using it and how you could use it to indicate this awkwardness of how history and time has prevented us from understanding the equivalent power of space, right? So you can see how this bias resulted in occluding and making it difficult to understand the generative powers of city space until the end of the 20th century. We've had a century and a half of this dominant social historicism in Western thought. I make a minor exception here in the Chicago School of Urban Ecology, but they still have a very physical explanation of the forces that shape the city, but at least they were exploring how space shapes social life and behavior. I don't want to go into that in any detail, but if you want to, we can talk about it later on. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time on this, and in a way I have to modify this because although the two key figures of Henri Lefebvre and Michel Foucault were co-occupying Paris, I just came back from a very exciting conference in Paris on spatial justice, which is going to be my 10th book, by the way, on this list, taking place at Nanterre, where 40 years ago, tomorrow, the next day, the famous events of Paris in 1968 took place. I spoke in an amphitheater Henri Lefebvre, because Lefebvre was teaching at Nanterre at the time, and his ideas about le droit et la ville, the right to the city, were primary forces in the events of Paris 1968, which, by the way, I think to some degree all of us here are still feeling the effects of in interesting ways that have been diluted, but I think are still there. And there were some other very exciting moments celebrated through this particular event. And as I say, I mentioned only these two, but there was also in 1969 Jane Jacobs' book that I told you about. And in 1973, Social Justice in the City. In 1972, Manuel Castells' The Urban Question. These are all turning points opening up a new way of thinking about space that, for the most part, were blocked by the inability to accept and understand the generative power of cities, of space. And if you didn't have any way of having any sense of that, these ideas just seem to be too radical and off base to be accepted. And so hence what I put at the bottom, modernist blockades, 25 years of resistance and deflection to the ideas of all of these individuals, Lefebvre, Foucault, Jane Jacobs, Harvey in particular, and only a kind of renaissance and remembering in recent years. That's another interesting book. Almost nothing is written on the interaction between Lefebvre and Foucault, and it was a remarkable coincidence in one way of describing it, that they both came up with an extraordinarily similar kind of radical new way of thinking about space. In the 30 years since, most people in geography and in other spatial disciplines have not seen that they were criticizing everyone's spatial and geographical imagination as inadequate and urging a radical shift in geographical thinking. Very little of that shift has occurred until fairly recently, and indeed recently even in geography and architecture, these central spatial disciplines, in many ways they have remained the most resistant to the new critical spatial thinking that's been emerging in a transdisciplinary way in recent years. Hence, what have we been talking about? The third book, there is a new book coming out called The Spatial Turn, the first book that I know of on this remarkable transdisciplinary diffusion. As John was mentioning, what we're beginning to do is think geographically in ways that are similar to the ways we've always been thinking historically. We don't blink at all if somebody tells us that everything that has ever existed and will exist and ever did exist in the past has a significant historical dimension, and that if we study it historically, we would gain enormous insight. Now, what's happening is we're beginning to say the same thing. Everything that has existed, will exist, ever did exist, has a significant geographical or spatial dimension. And that studying things geographically and spatially will lead to remarkable insight and discoveries, new ideas, revisions, radical revisions of old ideas. And hence this notion of the spatial turn extending well beyond the old spatial disciplines. I get invited now more than to lecture to geographers or architects or planners by other disciplines of an extraordinary range. You can't believe the range of disciplines. I've put down a few that I've recently lectured to here. Anthropology, art criticism in practice, art history, archaeology, accounting. I received an email several years ago from a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh saying that I've read your work in Lefebvre and Foucault and Harvey, and I've just discovered that our whole field had been mired in historicism, and I'm going to reconstruct the entire discipline, and my discipline is accounting. And I sort of checked on this, and I discovered that LSE is the center of radical accounting, that there are several Foucauldian accountants that, you know, space matters, but wow. Right? Then economics, which is experiencing an extraordinary recovery. By the way, much of this work on the generative power is done by economists who finally discovered that they can incorporate space into their econometric models, which is the only reason that they can explain that they're discovering this new stuff. So I invite everybody to jump in, non-economists. The economists are going to kill this brilliant jumbo idea if we allow economists only to explore it. Ethnomusicology, education. I constantly have education students coming to take my classes. Educational psychology, ethics, and eschatology. I'm hottest in religious studies. I don't know how it happened, but and because I'm not particularly religious at all myself, but Third Space in particular has become very popular in Bible studies. That was weird. But then some serious studies on a conference in Manchester in England on God, space in the city, and on another one in Chicago, Divinity School on space and nature, and how the spatialization and other changes in the nature of nature is affecting God's divinity, and how theologians study. Critical theologians are, by the way, into every theoretical arena, so that's not surprising. But I discovered I was particularly hot in eschatology, which is the theories of heaven and hell, of ends. And I said, what in the world is happening here? And they said, well, your Third Space has given us 3 ways to describe heaven and hell. We only had 2 before, now we have 3. And so I'm hot in eschatology. But I cannot, I mean, these are amusing, but they're indicative of an this is that word transdisciplinary. It may be loosely used in other contexts, but what's happening about spatial thinking is as close to defining what transdisciplinary is. It's cutting across every single discipline. I mean, I'm discovering there are journals on spatial rhetorics. I'm not even sure what it is, but the specialties are happening. Okay. One of the things that's coming out of this has to do with remarkable new discoveries. Thinking spatially in a way that gives it, putting space first, putting city space first, is beginning to open up new ways of thinking about cities that have been unopened before. And as I said, one of the earliest to discover this was Jane Jacobs in 1969, where she tried to reopen the debate and was put down by almost everyone. And it goes back to this notion that we have always been urban. And she began to explore, in a chapter, by the way, the first chapter of the book is called Putting Cities First. And she began to explore this remarkable topsy-turvy idea that cities were the primary force in the development of full-scale agriculture. You know, the old idea that somehow hunters and gatherers moved together to settle down in farming villages. There's no evidence whatsoever of that, by the way. We have evidence of hunters and gatherers settling down, but the villages and the towns and the cities that they created were not essentially farming villages or cities. So the idea that we had small farming villages, that became big farming villages, and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we had cities, ba-boom, that 99% of anthropologists and archaeologists still hold true, may not have been an accurate description. Now, maybe Jane Jacobs went too far in saying cities created the agricultural revolution, but there seems no doubt that we could never have developed full-scale agriculture without the urbanization process, that it was urbanization and the concentration of need and the need to expand the possibilities of society from its earlier conditions and scale that gave birth to the need to innovate economically in the production of food crops and of livestock. Now, there's no doubt that people knew how to plant seeds and reap the results at least 18,000 years ago. So these people who were coming in to form cities, they were people who knew how to farm. And so it's not a matter of inventing agriculture, but what cities did do, I think, and Jane Jacobs was one of the first to do this, to say this, was to provide the necessary spark for the development of full-scale, large-scale, agrarian societies. That is, societies who lived primarily on agriculture and livestock rearing. That without urbanization, this would not have happened. A reversal that's still being debated. Another area that I'm very pleased with is archaeology, which is as spatial as any discipline is. They've followed every development in geography for the last 40 years. And they're right on the tail of everything happening today. And they are beginning to explore this radical revisioning. It's sort of like continental drift and historical geology, for those of you who know that literature. You know, years ago when I studied geology, you would have these weird maps to say that, I don't know, Syracuse was once under the Atlantic Ocean, and then suddenly the mountains of 3,000, 10,000 feet came. And, you know, it was bizarre. How the hell could that happen? And then suddenly, eventually, continental drift, even though it was known back in 1912, continental drift became explained and completely revised all the geology textbooks. Well, I think this is going to be the same thing. We're going to see revisions of texts in a wide variety of fields. By the way, in economics, the economics texts are introducing a notion about these generative power of cities as the primary cause of all economic development. And you know what they're called? These forces are called Jane Jacobs externalities. very interesting. The persistence of anti-urbanism is another lecture with Mumford and so on and so forth. Here is a remarkable building because Jane Jacobs focused upon Çatalhöyük, which is not the oldest of these cities, but she projected cities much earlier. But Çatalhöyük was the creative center, the center of the creative class of the Neolithic, making some of the most important economic breakthroughs, but particularly artistic and aesthetic breakthroughs, and cultural breakthroughs, and religious and political and all kinds of things happening in Çatalhöyük 8,000 years ago. This is what the art history books call the oldest landscape painting. This is another indication of the anti-spatial bias. This is not a landscape. This is a cityscape. It's a picture of settlements, of a city. The first true development of large-scale architecture. This is the beginnings of social architecture of any substantial scale. A series of adobe-like, I mean, remarkable, I counted them once, 75 footprints of houses, of compound houses that were piled together to form this unusual city of Çatalhöyük in south-central, well, I can go jump ahead. This is the wall painting itself as it exists today at the university, at the museum in Ankara. There's a location going back of where Çatalhöyük is in southern Anatolia. The Asiklihyük is even older, and some other cities going to the east are being discovered on this day, every day almost, that are older. Well, let me go back to this, because it is truly remarkable. This is, as I say, a cityscape. It's the first artistic representation of, if those of you have read Levi-Strauss, the cooked, not the raw of nature. All art, all human art before this, some of it absolutely brilliant and wonderful art, up to this point, was depictions of natural settings, of nature, of hunting scenes, of men, of animals, of hunters, or geometric scenes, or other kind of colorful scenes. Here is a self-conscious painting of one's habitat, of the constructed city of maybe 10, 12, 15,000 people out of hunting bands of 100. Huh? An explosion in the scale of human society. I wish I'd brought along a picture of the actual reconstruction of the site itself. Very interesting. There were no streets. It was like an adobe packed together. There were no shared walls. Every one, as you can see here, every one of the housing compounds was independent, so that you could have 30 generations in the same spot. People would bury the dead in their homes in the center, and eventually, after a couple of generations, knock everything down and build it up again, so you didn't disturb your neighbor's wall. There were no roads, no pathways even. You moved from a hole in the roof through ladders up and down this adobe environment. All kinds of, no surrounding walls, except the fact that the buildings together produced walls, so there wasn't a heavy defensive fortification, unlike Jericho, which is which is older than Çatalhöyük, where there was a substantial wall built from the very beginning, and so many interesting things about it. This is the first place that humans constructed mirrors out of obsidian, the volcanic glass that was so vital in Stone Age technology, which was the major item in international trade, because long-distance trade was vital to these first hunter and gatherer metropolises, as Jane Jacobs called them, these first hunting and gathering cities, not agricultural cities at first, but evolving into agricultural cities by producing agricultural land uses around them as an urban occupation, farming as an urban occupation. The rural was constructed out of the urban. And villages, the first villages were probably not even agricultural villages, but livestock trading points. And there's so much inventiveness in Çatalhöyük. As I say, it's not the earliest, but was probably the biggest, and certainly, in Florida's terms as well, the most creative. The first rugs, if you can look up Çatalhöyük in rug theory journals, and they're awesome, you know, kilim periodicals, that you would find Çatalhöyük, look up Çatalhöyük, you find lots of hits on rugs. It also is the center of the goddess cult revival in recent years. There's even special guided tours of Çatalhöyük for members of the goddess cult, because Çatalhöyük represents or evokes a notion of egalitarian society across genders, across gender, and a strong, possibly even matrilineal power in the city, a strong equality of the sexes, relatively peaceful, and productive of extraordinary art, of goddesses and other figures in enormous numbers and of incomparable quality. So there was an artistic revolution taking place here. The first rugs, the first textiles, the first, not thrown, but first molded pottery, the first copper working and metal working known to human life is found in Çatalhöyük. So this was a creative burst around 9,000 years ago, 8 to 9,000 years ago, that was perhaps more intense than in any place at that time anywhere in the world. So this is another kind of book, or many books that need to be written. The evolution is very interesting. Every day there's new finds. It's extraordinary, because we can see a movement from the cities here about 10,000 years ago towards Mesopotamia, but in stages along the way, and they're finding more and more cities along the way before the beginnings of what many call the urban revolution in Mesopotamia 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So we had 6,000 years of urban life evolving towards the first of what we call cities that we're now opening up to investigation today. Respatializing Aristotle is another way of going back and rethinking a lot. I use that word, first word there, Cynicismos, is the word that I use to produce my term for the generative power of cities, the term Cynicism. Eikos, the O-I-K in there, is the term that we use for economics and ecology and echistics, having to do with the home. All right, home economics was the beginnings of economics, and hence the term economics. Ecology, again, had this notion of the interactive and interdependency of coming together in space, in a particular area. And ismos is just a condition of, and sin means together. So it's coming together to form a common bond in a particular place. And it was a term that Aristotle used for the formation of the polis, of the city-state. That the city-state was formed through a process of cynicism, a cynicismos. There's an English translation that is spelled S-Y-N-O-E-C-I-S-M and pronounced cynicism, so I didn't like the word for a variety of reasons, and gave back the K from the Greek to make it cynicism. And the argument is that this is the city formation process. Why I mean respatializing Aristotle is that I've been looking in all of the English translations of Aristotle's Politics and Nicomachean Ethics and all kinds of things for any discussion of this, which I knew he did, and I couldn't find it. And I'm convinced that literature in English on Aristotle despatialized it, took out the spatial terms because it didn't understand them, not because they did something in any conspiratorial way, but they didn't understand his spatial arguments because of this distortion of the 19th century. And so I want to go back to Aristotle and rediscover his spatial arguments. And the one geographer planner, one of the finest in the world today, that I urge you all to read if you're interested in these larger kinds of questions, is a Turkish geographer planner called Engin Aysin, or Ishin, I-S-I-N, in York University in Canada, who's written a book called Being Political. And his argument is that the very nature of being political is rooted in being urban. The urban defined the political. In Greek, the people who lived in the city, in the polis as the city-state, were called polites. The people who didn't live in the city, who were not incorporated into the vital political life of the urban, were called idiotas. The idiocy of rural life has nothing to do with mental capacity. It has to do with political organization. That was Marx's use of the term. The idiocy of rural life has nothing to do with stupid farmers. It has to do with the inability to organize farmers politically because they're so idiosyncratic. That's another IDIO word, not IDEO, although the links are interesting. Another term that Aristotle used is phronesis. Phronesis is a kind of, when it gets used today, the three forms of knowledge that Aristotle taught, well, that's going to be, I'm sorry, were techne, episteme, and phronesis. We know techne from technology, we know episteme from epistemology. Those are the two forms of knowledge we always talk about. Phronesis we don't talk about. But the argument is that's the most basic form, and it has to do with organizing urban life as planners, architects, and urban designers and managers. Did I go 2 or 1? Okay. The other argument is, continuing on from this, that the industrial revolution was also urban generated. People said, oh, you silly, how can you say that? The first factories were along rapids and in rural areas, and people were milling things. And it's the same argument about agriculture. We didn't see the full development of industrial society, industrial capitalist society, without full-scale urbanization. Urbanization and industrialization wed together in the late 19th century in Western Europe, in places like Manchester. And you've seen the evolution of the industrial capitalist city. Always the evolution of urban industrial capitalism. We've lost the urban proletariat, the urban bourgeoisie, urban industrial capitalism, urban capitalism. This is urbanized capitalism, but we've had that bias to take away urban causality, so we couldn't put urban first in using these terms. And we've lost the urban and lost the urban causality. Now it's being resurrected. I'm just going to go through this because it's got nice visuals. That we're seeing today, we all are aware of globalization. But the question is, what is globalizing? What is the thing that's globalizing? Well, we're seeing capital, labor, culture. But these were globalizing in the past. We've had globalization going on, some would say at least since the 16th century, but others would say 2,000, 3,000 years further back. But what's distinctive about the present is that we're seeing a globalization of urban industrial capitalism. A globalization of the urban and an urbanization of the globe is what we're seeing as the distinctive quality of this contemporary period of globalization, making every square inch of the earth to some degree urbanized, including the Amazon, including Siberia, Antarctica, the oceans, as well as Manlius and so on and so forth outside certain. that everywhere is being globalized and urbanized. It's sort of easier to realize that manlius is globalized. But even the rural areas around it are urbanized. This is what's happening, and it's happening, spreading out all over the world and opening up new ways of thinking about cities and of regions. Another thing that, by the way, Richard Florida is talking about, these mega city regions. The whole world is urbanized. Every city is globalized. We are all urbanists today. And here's just a picture of it. This is the famous shot of the world at night, so you can see the great energy sites, which are, of course, urban sites around the world. And here is a list of the million-plus cities. We know now that the majority of the world's population live in cities, and we're growing to the point where the majority will be living in million-plus city regions. So this is an evolution, picture of the evolution of million-plus city regions. In 1825, we have, I think, London and Beijing. I guess that's Paris added in 1850. Oops, a little more. New York jumps up there. 1900, oh, we're seeing a bit of a multiplication. 1925, 1950, 1975, 2000. Things are shifting radically regionally. They're now, and the United Nations now calculates them. I used to, as a kid, love to see the list. I used to list all of the world's cities over 100,000. I couldn't ever do that today. But the United Nations rekindled my interest because now they're listing all of the city regions. They call them city regions, over 1 million. And the last count, I think, in the last book was 423 or something. But now they're probably getting closer to 500 of these city regions of more than 1 million, some of which have more than 60 million in them. City regions of 60 million people. These are mega city regions, part of this new urban age that we're experiencing. This is just some people at LSE estimating the population growth per hour of cities around the world, to give you just some indication of the location of the urban change. The new regionalism is something I'm particularly interested in, another major book. I talk about, when I talk to geographers, I talk about mesogeographies. Oh, by the way, when I talk to architects, I talk about thinking regionally, because architects have enormous difficulty with the regional scale, and with everything in between the urban and the global, right? And you know of buildings, and then you know of clusters of buildings. That's called urban design or community design. And then you have clusters of buildings. That's the city. Right? And then above clusters of buildings is the world. An irrelevant world for the built environment and design. I am trying to enrich this with multiple layers of regional impact, every single one of them shaping your projects. How you make designs of buildings are going to be shaped by the multiple regional layers that all of us live in. Multiple regional, nodal regions going from the body, where the architects can move down to pretty easily and comfortably and do some interesting creative work, the body space as region, right? Ego at the center, especially for architecture. No. And the multiple scales going upward to the neighborhood, the region, the urban, the city metropolitan region, the subnational region, the nation state, the supranational, et cetera, all of which are increasingly influential on the local in this age of globalization and urbanization. And here talking about regional causality and the creation of major governance challenges, how to govern these huge megacity regions that are emerging as important motive forces of the global economy and of motive forces of enormous inequalities, because this is the other generative power of cities for the last 12,000 years. Not only generative of positive economic development, but generative of hierarchies of social power of differential, of inequality, of patriarchy, of economic domination, of cultural domination, and so on, as also part of this generative power of cities. So it's not just the kind of very happy, positive generation that's coming from urban life, but urban life is also generative of many of these negative, and now, of course, environmental degradation becoming, moving to near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. So the new regionalism and new regional perspectives are vital for all disciplines, and there's been a sort of revival of regionalism at all these scales. If any of you feel like checking on the breadth, and there's lots of things from architects on this, unlike ever before. You would do regions, if you could Google regions 10 years ago, and regionalism, there would be no architectural interest whatsoever. But Google the new regionalism in parentheses to keep it under some control. Google the new regionalism, you get, I don't know, 80,000 hits. And many of them have to do with architects. Some of them are having to do with old Frampton's regionalism, but some are trying to adapt to other aspects of the new regionalisms. Mesogeographies means between the macro and the micro, between the global and the local. It's not a matter of think global, act local. That's much too simple. It's think global, act global, think regional, act regional, think local, act local, and sort of everywhere in between as well. That there are multiple scales, and the theory of scale is of great importance here. For every one, as I say here, theorizing scale, especially for architects to understand the dynamics of scale in a contemporary world. The last two books, remember these are books that I'm hoping to write, and somebody else should write if I don't write them. The word is not yet being used in English very widely at all, the word spatial capital, but this is descriptive of this generative economic power of cities that what Jane Jacobs began to discover as capitals using space. We've all, not all of us, but a lot of people have become interested in the notion of social capital. If there's social capital, then there's spatial capital. And there should be an easy jump from social capital to spatial capital in terms of understanding what we're talking about. And here we're getting some very important work done by the new economic geographers and geographical economists on the regional kinds of issues here, and on this emerging concept of spatial capital. One of my colleagues I mentioned here, Michael Stolper, has written an interesting article also available on Google with the title Buzz, the Economic Power of Cities, where he's talking about the continuing importance of face-to-face contact. And by the way, all of this importance of space is happening at a time when a great chunk of thinkers are talking about the internet as if it were leading to the death of distance and the end of geography. And space doesn't matter anymore, distance doesn't matter anymore. And at the same time, all of these arguments are saying it matters more than you ever imagined, even in the age of the internet. And this is partly all of these arguments that are being made here. And lastly, the book I am writing and trying to finish this year is called Seeking Spatial Justice. And it deals with the fact that the formation of geographies has injustices embedded within it. And that these inequalities, injustices in the geographies that we build, from the mass transit networks that we construct to the buildings that you design, create occasionally, not always, oppressive spaces. Spaces that do bad things to us. Right? And if we begin to realize this process of the spaces that we produce having negative effects on our lives, we can begin to mobilize to change those geographies. Famous phrase from May 68 in Lefebvre, changer la vie, changer la vie. Change life, change the city, change life. That's just, I don't want to end with a slogan, but that we're talking now about arguments about old ones about territorial justice, but now talking about spatial justice, putting space first in terms of understanding social justice or economic justice from a spatial perspective, understanding urban spatial causality. I just want to end with a brief comment on what's been happening in Los Angeles. I didn't mention Los Angeles at all. I don't think so. I'm very proud of it, actually. But Los Angeles is the place where these debates on space are actually entering directly into political practice. And the one example that I think is the prime example is of something called the Bus Riders Union, in which the working poor of Los Angeles organized to sue the Metropolitan Transit Authority, saying that fixed rail transit, which was being planned in a $30 billion plan for Los Angeles so that it could become like New York with its own subway, was discriminatory, racially discriminatory against the poor, because the poor needed flexible transit, particularly the working poor today with multiple jobs, with multiple locations. They get spokes on a wheel that go from the center of Los Angeles, which isn't big at all, to the suburbs, to the wealthy suburbs, whereas their daily needs are to have a much more flexible network that only buses are going to be able to provide, because they can't afford cars to use on the streets. Remember, 40,000 people, 40% of the population of Los Angeles are at or below the poverty level, right? A really serious problem. And they were able to bring a suit that had been tried several times before in other cities on a civil rights basis. That is, it's discriminatory against minorities and the poor, the fixed rail transit versus bus transit. And every one of those lost. In Los Angeles, there was feed-in from the urban planning department, good spatial thinkers, not me particularly, but my colleagues and students and others were feeding into this legal case. And they made an additional argument that the transit plan of the Metropolitan Transit Authority was not just racially unjust, it was spatially or geographically unjust. And they won the case. They won a court order that demanded that new buses, improved bus timing, reduced bus crime, all be placed at 1, 2, 3 priority on the budget of the MTA. It contributed to the eventual stoppage of the building of the mass network that was being initially planned and built at the time, and led to, there were advantages to building rail. I'm not saying that they should never build any rail, but what this did was something quite remarkable in American urban history. The general trend has always been, according to what David Harvey said 30 years ago, more than that the normal workings of an urban system, daily life, planning, insurance, retail, shopping, the labor market, the housing market, normally works, if left alone, to redistribute real income from the poor to the rich. The rich get richer by the daily workings of a good industrial capitalist city. No conspiracy, nothing, no redlining. You don't have to have nasty, evil people doing anything. You would tend to lead to an unbalanced growth in which the rich would get richer faster than the poor would get richer. It doesn't mean that the poor have to get absolutely poor, but the rich will always work, everything will work to their advantage. And if you intervene in this, most of the time the rich will be more powerful to be more politically effective and they will win. So normally planning and everything else works in favor of the wealthy more than the poor. Here we had an example of a plan, of a shift of billions of dollars from plan A that would have continued to help the rich more than the poor, to plan B, which helped the poor more than the rich. A multi-billion-dollar shift. And part of this, as I say, is as a result of putting space and city space first. Thanks. again, it goes back to the ontological kind of issue, that every experience has to be seen as partly spatial, or as spatial to some degree. Whether the spatial is very heavily influential or not heavily influential depends. But every concept, we've learned not to separate space off as external, to experience, to logic, to thinking, to action, to designing. And what I'm saying is that it has to be seen no longer as external, but as internal to everything. Everything social, political, creative, economic, has a spatial dimension. You have no problem. Would you ever ask an historian, how is experience taken into account in history? You might ask it, but unlikely. But I'm basically saying that everything that you've seen having an historical dimension, and an historical dimension that you recognize could be quite important, is also true of the spatial dimension. And that's the real heart of what I'm saying.
Yeah, building on that question, I think it discloses a kind of architectural understanding of space as different than maybe a geographical understanding of space. It implies that socially and politically motivated kind of catalytic activities are separate from space. But I think geography understands them to be inseparable.
I don't think you need to praise geography in this, too. I think there are just as many in geography that have the same dead, fixed idea about what space is. Fixed as physical form, as physical design, as something external and outside that you shape as a material condition, has been the traditional way that even the spatial disciplines have thought about space. And many in the spatial disciplines today continue to think about it that way. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that's only part of the story. We must start to think about space in a dynamic way, as process. Process has always been connected to time. Space as process, that's weird. We haven't thought about that. But that's also part of the blockage. Time is not the exclusive. The famous phrase that's repeated all the time is Foucault's. Why is it we think about space as fixed, dead, undialectical, as background, environment, container, stage, whereas we think of time as dynamic, process, developmental, dialectic, problematic, challenging, process, all of that stuff. What happened? How did that happen? That wasn't there in 1800. But was there in 1900 and has continued throughout the 20th century today and still boxes in our thinking. And it's only now that that's being smashed a bit. The most resistant people are the ones who think they know space already. I talk about the spatial turn to geographers and they say, well, we've always been spatial. We've always sort of put geography first. So in many ways, they're resistant. That's why some of the most creative things are coming outside of the spatial disciplines. I'm not sure about whether eschatologists are going to deliver very much, but or the accountants, but maybe. The archaeologists will, the economists will, the anthropologists will. But this is a kind of, I'm being a little combative here about my two favorite disciplines, yes.
And I just wanted to say on behalf of the board, how much we enjoyed your talk. I have actually a question. And reading Mike Davis's book, Planet of Storms, and one of the points that he makes is that the fastest rate of urbanization right now is sub-Saharan Africa. But that there does seem to be a big disconnect between economic growth and actual urbanization. That is, if you look at what's been going on in sub-Saharan Africa over the last quarter century, economic growth has often been very, very low, but urbanization is much higher.
Yeah.
And in fact, what seems to be happening is that people are being pushed out of the rural areas as opposed to being pulled to the cities. Does that in some way challenge some of the arguments that have been often made about the necessary connection between economic development, industrialization, and the urban? Because
Yeah, no, there's no inconsistency here, but it's partially inconsistency based on the fact that we know so little about the fact, what is it about, cities don't automatically generate, right? We also know that. Historically, whether we're talking about the present era, which I usually focus on, but if we talk about from the 50s to 1975, what you saw in most third world countries was hyper-urbanization, a disjoint between the urbanization and the industrialization process. That was at a time when industrialization was almost forbidden structurally from the third world. Now the relationship has changed. What's happening is we're seeing industrialization spread in these last 30 or 40 years of urbanization, but it's spreading, as every geographer would recognize, geographically unevenly, all right? So we have the extraordinary generative force of urban industrialization right now at its peak in world history in China, right? And we've seen the tigers of East Asia, the Celtic tiger of Ireland, the growing little tigers of Chile and elsewhere. We're seeing places where this urbanization and industrialization process is operating synergetically. In this process, there have been lots of places left out. Over these years, none of this has been happening, almost none of it has been happening in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe in southern Africa a little bit. But now we're beginning to see it. It's very late, and over the years we've had, what have we had? We've had this extraordinary fourth world, fifth world, to define the areas left out. The great tragedy of Africa has been the fact that it's been left out for all of these years. The hope that we're beginning to see, and there's always a difference between Mike Davis and I on almost everything. I look for a little bit of hope in a despairing situation, and he smothers all hope with despair. And so the hope is that what we are finally beginning to see is this generative growth beginning to happen in Africa. But it's happening on a very difficult base. So right now, there's still a tremendous disjoint that exists, but it has to be seen in this global scale. As he does for most of the planet of slums, because what he's saying is that there's now not just this 51% of the world's population is urban, but that 1/3 of the world lives in slums. And by the way, that goes right back to the initial urban industrial revolution in Manchester, when you first, urban industrial capitalism has one interesting feature. It has always from the beginning required slums. The only mode of production or only culture and society and economy that finds immiseration necessary and strategically important. And so the first industrialization brought in millions who were forced out of the countryside in the ways you're already talking about, happening now. It's push and pull always operating together. Piling into the cities as laborers, as urban proletariat, urban industrial bourgeoisie owning the factories, and the lumpen proletariat, the homeless, the jobless, Irish outcasts, who, where were they? They were living nice close by in the worst conditions any city had seen up to that point. You know, 19th century Manchester was much worse than Ur and Çatalhöyük in terms of depth of poverty. And so we have, you know, this larger picture is there, but it's not a simple causality. We don't know. Richard Florida, if you read the book, you'll see he has a theory, right? And you know what his theory is? It's bohemians and gays are the primary cause of development. That if you cluster together in any city creative bohemians and gay men, because it doesn't work with gay women. Lesbians statistically don't work as a generative force. So that's why I want you to steal this book or destroy this book, but because it's much too easy. We just don't know very much either about whether big agglomerations generate more than small ones, what kind of agglomerations generate most, why do some agglomerations generate and others don't? I think John was asking me, well, what about your theory in Syracuse? And it's very difficult to know, because what I'm seeing in Syracuse is a kind of disintegration of what used to be an urban central blob into sort of multiple little islands of little clusters. And I don't know, maybe that's productive. I don't know. We just don't know about it. But we know at least what to look for, to start looking at, to see that relationship. And so, yeah, these are all interesting stories. And of course, as you know, I'm very sensitive to the African situation. And no, I don't think this. I think it opens it up again to another interpretation of what's happening. Yeah.
Perhaps
Yeah.
you can hear me already. You've touched on them a few times tonight, but I'm just wondering what it is that grates you most about Richard Florida.
I'm actually very friendly about Richard, in many ways. And if you talk to my students, you'll hear me insisting that they spend a lot of time going through Florida's work. I think what grates me most at the moment was just taking a look at that book just before this lecture and realizing that no matter what I say, he's going to get all the attention as a popular book. But no, I think his work has to be reckoned with. It's very important. It's an empire, and I have some political questions about empire building. I have some questions, maybe, yeah, is there an element of envy or jealousy? Probably in it, but he's sacrificed academic quality of writing for a popular style to feed in to his celebrity. I'm not making these heavy arguments to be celebrated for celebrity's sake. And he's taking these arguments and doing something in general, getting it out to the general public in ways that I can't do, that I respect. But the idea that the book starts with the Stephen Colbert Show was just annoying. So there are these little aspects that. But no, I think there's a lot of people that dismiss him entirely. So I'm glad you raised the question. I certainly don't want to dismiss him entirely. I was suggesting that you don't give him any more money. He recently, he's of tremendous importance in planning, but the great problem is that they literally oversimplify his ideas. If you can see, and he does this, he suggests read Jane Jacobs right away and get it connected into the other work that's being done in geographical economics so that you can see some of the deeper things that are behind what he's playing with. You can avoid some of these images that people have of some of his work, like, the one I was telling John is recently, there are two people who get money out of this more than anybody else. Certainly Mike doesn't get any money out of his work, Mike Davis. But Porter, who is the father of clusters in Harvard University, he's the first to teach an economic geography course at a business school, teaching about clusters. And he was hired by, I don't know if I hear a British accent, but hired by the Labour government some years ago to come. They gave him £160,000 to tell the Labour members of Parliament how to produce clusters in the economy. It was ridiculous. Recently, Florida is hired by the government of Singapore. Singapore is having such success as an economic city, it's decided to become a cultural city, and occupying Zaha Hadid and bunches of global architects to build opera houses and museums and so on. And they've gotten Richard Florida come over to be the honcho, the consultant on how to make Singapore a cultural city, a cultural capital. And my vision was the plan is deciding, the Singapore plan is ordering a container ship of gay people. And they just sort of bring in a container of gaze and plug it in, and they've got a cultural city. But that is joking of Florida. Yes. Anything else?
Well, as you're talking about transdisciplinarity and also interdisciplinarity, and it's starting to occur in us understanding, beyond modernism, that it takes more than a Corbusier or someone to design a city, and it really takes a city to design a city. And kind of continuing what you were saying about the process of space, and also your anecdote about Los Angeles, what do you think the interface is going to be in the future for designing our cities? If it's going to require many actors playing many roles, is it the internet? Is it some sort of democratic interface, or how do you see it?
Well, I don't answer either or questions usually. But yeah, I think it's going to require multidisciplinary teams. If I can read into your question a interpretation of the architect's mentality in it, it's going to have to reduce any residual feeling that the architect is the kingmaker of the city, and the kind of opening up of the idea that cities are produced by architects who build buildings, and to make architects think more like geographers. I also, if I were in a different auditorium, maybe suggest that geographers also should think sometimes a little bit more like architects too. But yeah, I think that the architect is more challenged with regard to scale than the geographer. That's what they can learn. I would like to also talk about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. To architects in particular, to say, start with your brothers and sisters in the spatial disciplines. Don't jump to Deleuze and Guattari automatically. There's a lot to be learned from geography and urban and regional planning, from the new regionalism and the new geographical thinking, from architects at a level that is in your language, rather than going out and poaching some weird stuff from somebody else. And so I think that intersection also building in other specialties in anthropology and so on. But in a way, we're all becoming spatial thinkers. And this is very important politically and intellectually and in terms of the future of cities, is that spatial thinking, and this is what I'm saying, I didn't realize that it's connected to another argument I always make. Thinking about space, critical spatial thinking, is a kind of glue that connects different disciplines as well as social movements as well as other political things together. We can all share this notion that we shape the spaces around us and then they shape us, and that space can do bad things for us as well as good things for us, and that we can organize together to do things to make space better. Suddenly that becomes something that we can share across gender lines, across class lines, across racial and ethnic lines, across disciplinary boundaries, that the spatial turn is providing a new kind of interactive, communicative glue that didn't exist before. When we had history as the glue, it essentialized things too much. It channeled us into essentialized channels. We could all share the historical experience of being dominated, but that doesn't create a kind of glue that connects the social movements and other kinds of things together. The shared spatiality of oppression, exploitation, domination, or, I don't know, bad news or something, can work to make that connective tissue. And that's vital for interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary things. So this, start with the spatial, put space first. I guess that's what I've been saying.
I have two questions. My first question is simple. In the first diagram you had there, they had a big, with the ancient city.
Yeah.
It was on the wall.
Yeah.
They showed a square with 4 tiny squares around it. Does that mean the 4 columns, those are the 4 columns around the square?
No, these were very basic houses. Those From what I understand, those were abstractions of the houses, and there weren't any columns, as far as I know, in the original houses. And this was a vision from on top of the settlement, looking down. It was not an abstract drawing. It was actually a picture looking across. But no, I've been fascinated. What fascinated me just was the fact how they were all different. Not one of them was alike, despite the fact that all of the reconstructions of the site were showing them as exactly the same. Everybody's building was about the same. But I don't know of any columns.
Okay, the second question was,
Is that me?
No, it's not you.
what's the success of hexagon cities in ancient times?
There are no hexagon cities. Hexagons are lovely abstract shapes in hypothetical worlds of central places. They're were round and oval cities, walled cities. Hexagons, they weren't particularly hexagonal. Hexagons come from crystallis trade areas and are efficiency packing. And the walls of cities and the shapes of cities have nothing to do with packing together. So you wouldn't find the hexagon as a particularly useful form for cities. You might find internally, I don't know, some market neighborhoods, but not the hexagon shape itself in the material reality is not likely to be of any significance, I don't think. I'm slow.
One last question. One thing I recall from Jane Jacobs is that one reason she emphasizes the role of cities in giving rise to agriculture is not just the city's capacity to control infrastructure and development, but also the city's role in producing agricultural tools like plows and organizing seeds and things like this. And so for Jacobs, there's a strong role of the manufacturing city as a generative force. But of course, what we have seen in the last 50 years or so, especially places like Syracuse, is the decline of the manufacturing city. So how do you see urban deindustrialization fitting into the primacy of cities as generative forces?
Yeah, great question. That's sort of 3 lectures on my course, but I don't use the word post-industrial because I think it's an early blind man seeing the elephant early on and not knowing exactly what they saw and making some conclusions about it. I don't think there's been a simple end deindustrialization without reindustrialization, that we've only seen deindustrialization at times, and we've only seen a decline in manufacturing rather than a recovery of a new kind of manufacturing, and a restructuring of the very nature of those old sectors that we define primary, secondary, and tertiary. So if you start including producer services in the industrial sector and producing sector, and you talk about the production of goods and services, you begin to see that the employment pattern has not changed very dramatically. If you start looking at the generative power in terms of value added in the economy, the reduction has been nowhere near, even in old manufacturing sectors, because service sectors don't generate that much, except when the service sectors serve production. If you talk about production of information, the production of media, the production of software, and the production of the culture industries, entertainment and jewelry and fashion, even sometimes I'm saying, is McDonald's a factory producing 1 billion commodities a year that's consumed quickly? If we begin to break down our old boundaries of the old sectors, then we begin to see that we're still industrial capitalism. I put post in front of a lot of words, but the 3 words I will not put post in front of are urban, industrial, capitalism. We are still we are more in urban industrial capitalism than ever before. And the Chinese are benefiting from an American misinterpretation of what's been happening, saying that we can produce a continued affluent society based on services. To have a president come and say we're having a recession or we've just been invaded by 9/11 and the way we should respond is go out and shop. This is crazy economics that's formed from a misjudgment, the famous post-industrial misjudgment, I think. That doesn't mean that everything's the same. We've seen deep deindustrialization taking place everywhere, but also a process of reindustrialization that we have to understand. So in order to understand the world, and partly the answer also to the question about Africa, is to understand the changing dynamics of urbanization and industrialization, that we're seeing new industrialization taking place, a new economy that's still an industrial capitalist economy, an urban-based, generated industrial capitalist economy. So, that's the answer to the question, yeah, in a capsule form, yeah.